Next on Investigative Report. A man falls head over heels in love with a woman who he believes loves him back for who he is and not his income. They enlist the services of a wedding planner and a jeweler to prepare the day that their friends and family will witness an oath that should last a lifetime. They purchase a sizable home together and all the contents needed to fill it. With the child in tow, they buy their first expensive couple's car together. But in one day, in fact 1 hour, not only does that woman break that lifetime contract, but she breaks the man she had signed it for a lifetime to come. Through divorce court and alimony scam. There are many varying laws governing divorces in America, as there are states. In fact, laws may vary from county to county within those same autonomous states. Today on Investigative Report, we choose to look at the divorce laws and the subsequent burdening alimony payments granted in the northeastern state of Massachusetts. In this state, we highlight the valiant efforts of one divorced man who made U.S. history. He did this by taking on and changing the laws of lifetime alimony payments. Mr. Steve Hitner fought diligently over some 15 long years without quitting, even though he wanted to. As you will see in this program, he'll tell you his own story. But because Steve didn't quit, he garnered the support of thousands of people in his same alimony predicament, to include the efforts of groups of women who named themselves the Second Wives Club. Together they changed what previously had been the issuance of alimony to a former spouse for a lifetime. On September the 26th of the year 2011, some of the same media that did not support Steve's efforts initially gathered for the photo op with the Governor Deval Patrick as he signed into law the Massachusetts Alimony Reform Act. Today we will interview Steve Hitner, but first, take a look at some of the previous alimony horror stories that prompted Steve's 15-year David vs. Goliath act, through good times, through bankruptcy, in order to change the law.
I had no money to pay any living expenses. I had no money to pay any alimony. I had no money to pay any additional alimony. I had no money to pay the attorney's expenses. I had nothing.
It was like being in a war zone.
I had to file bankruptcy.
The divorce, because of its prolonged time of events, is worse than my son dying.
I felt that if I left, I would never see my kids again. That's exactly what happened.
I lost a lot of good years of my life, and I'm paying for it now.
It was an ugliness that just constantly nagging at you.
There is no end point on it.
So I was in criminal hearings. They're put in jail. And then when they're put in jail, they have even less ability to make the payments. They're crushed.
And the first thing they do when you go to jail is they revoke your Social Security right away.
If I died, then of course it's insurance. But if I got sick,
Until the death of either party.
It's double the amount of money I make.
So what we called it was a death sentence.
It became a horror show.
It was a wasted 25 years of my life.
Look what you've done to me. He was so desperate.
One thing I didn't want to do was have my income combined with John's in order to support an ex-spouse.
The judge made a ridiculous statement. I think you're still making the same amount of money. I want you to pay $1,200. I want you to pay $200 on top of that. I want you to pay attorney's fees on top of that. And then he put me in jail.
Things are going along well. I get a summons in the mail. Going back to court again.
He was a broken man.
They agree to an amount. They think I have hidden money someplace, or I got a money tree growing out of my ass. And then 2 weeks later, they'll demand more money.
Over $250,000 legal fees later, in the bankruptcy, I had to start over.
It was like being raped by the court system.
I don't have anything left.
There was nothing that you should destroy another person over.
Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Steve Hitner to Investigative Reports. Steve is the president and founder of Massachusetts Alimony Reform. Steve is also a divorce consultant and a mediator in such cases. Now, when I found out about Steve, I had to have him on his show because a lot of guys come to me with relationship problems and they're moving towards divorce, and I don't have the answers for that. So Steve is somebody that I found that has the answers for that because he's been through this problem. Steve ended his marriage in 1995 after 23 years of marriage to his wife. The marriage did not end as well as it began, but he was able to move on. But it started a movement that grew into something that helps everybody at this point. And it was that Steve entered it into what refers to as the Twilight Zone, you say, right, Steve?
Yep.
Of alimony. Tell us something about that.
Well, I found that when you go to the family court system, there's a big sign over the archway. It says, when you enter this archway, leave common sense, fairness, and reasonableness behind. It's in the Twilight Zone of divorce.
That is the Twilight Zone, sir.
Up means down, down means up, and everything's upside down.
So it's not anything that you would expect of any kind of common sense, I'd imagine, right?
No, most people think that you get divorced, you have a few years of alimony, you split the assets, and you move on with your life. But in Massachusetts, it was very different than that. In Massachusetts, you were, no matter how long you were married, you could be married 3.5 years, and you owe alimony for life.
For life?
And you had to maintain the ex-spouse, unearning spouse, or lesser earning spouse, to the lifestyle of the marriage. It's insane.
Now, how is that possible where you have a young man who's married 3.5 years probably, and a guy who's been married like 20 or 40 or 50 years, but the young man is scheduled to pay for life, no matter how much his income increases? What kind of sense would that make before you change that current law? What sense does that make?
Well, we actually had a guy who was married for 3.5 years, and he got divorced, and he had to pay for life.
Wow.
See, the problem in Massachusetts at the time is with many courts, the judge could not put a limit to the term of alimony because they didn't have what they said, a crystal ball. What the needs were of the former spouse.
So
an mandate to it.
At the time, your divorce trial lasted 3 days, you said, but the judgment took 10 long months.
Yeah, the judge didn't rule for 10 months. She was a lazy judge.
She drug it out?
And when she didn't rule, my ex-wife took me to court, Superior Court, sued my company, sued me, sued my account, sued everybody.
Wow.
And so we went to Superior Court and they threw it out and put it back to the judge to rule again, and the judge had died.
Oh!
So I had to start all over again.
That is the Twilight Zone. So the whole thing cost you, what, $150,000?
$250,000.
And you had to pay $865 a month
a week
to your wife in perpetuity, right?
You got that wrong. It cost me $250,000 in legal fees, and I had to pay her $865 a month. A week.
A week. Now that's why that would be funny.
The house, plus the car, plus the dog.
And bankruptcy.
Well, I found that the only way that I could win was to change the law. Because the law didn't make sense.
Now, for a lot of you viewers that's watching right now, understand what Steve is talking about. Steve told me that it was not as much as it was the lawyers or the court. There was an antiquated law he's talking about that has existed on the books for a long time, and people just try to fight against that law. So he doesn't want you to be an adversary of the court. He decided not to fight the court, but to get the law changed. And you got that law changed, right, Steve?
Well, I started to research alimony and started a website called Mass Alimony Reform. And just posting some stories and situations and asking if anybody else had run into it. Well, women started answering my website. These women were second wives of people who got married, and they were forced to use their income and assets to pay the ex-wife alimony.
Now, also when he's talking here, this is a great point Steve brings up. If you didn't know it, and you was in Massachusetts at the time, or some other state, what Steve was talking about, he had the help of some women called the Second Wives Club. So the first wives were getting alimony, but if a man married again, which Steve did, his second wife's income will be grouped into his income and seen as something that he could pay an additional increase to his first wife. So the second wives didn't like that at all. They didn't want to get their income attached to paying for the old wife. So they formed a group called the Second Wives Club, and a bunch of women worked with Steve and his friends to get this law overturned. Tell us something about this, Steve.
Well, you know, when the stories started coming out about the second wife situation, they gained a lot of traction. And a journalist from New York City who was engaged to a guy in Massachusetts called me up one day and said, "Is this true?" I said, "Yes, here's the name of some woman who was happening to." She called me back in sometime later. I produced an article that was published in the Boston Globe called "The Chilling Effect that Massachusetts Divorce Has on Marriage in Massachusetts." And that exploded the thing. Women started canceling their weddings and giving me some more fodder for the press, and I send the stories out. I consider what I do is I dug up the bodies. Nobody believed that this was happening until they dug up the bodies and saw the horror stories that were going on.
Yeah, because you say that the legislature doesn't want to move until there's enough traction in their district. So if you cause enough trouble in that district, they want to move, right?
First of all, Massachusetts has legislation that does nothing.
Nothing.
I was friends with a previous governor, and he said it's the worst job he ever had. These people do nothing, absolutely nothing. Anything that can be offensive to anybody, they won't do. Anything that takes any bold moves, they will not do. The worst bunch of people I've ever known in my whole life. Somebody with a lot of good ideas comes into the legislature, they get very depressed very quickly when nothing happens. As a matter of fact, a person who introduced one of the bills that we put in said to me that the legislators don't act until they believe that there's trouble in their village.
Trouble in their village, they have to move on it, or they're...
I would tell people, what you want to do is this. Go to a fundraiser of your local legislator. Go talk to him. Give him a check for $25. Tell him it's all you can afford. And tell him your horror story. Then you want to be friends to tell them the horror story. And so now, if 2 or 3 people tell them the horror stories, they feel there's trouble in their village. And then they'll go on and they'll act.
So when the Boston Globe featured you, you got picked up by CNN, Fox News, and other outlets, right? That kind of started rolling.
ABC and NBC. Every week I was in the phone call from another reporter want to know what's going on.
On one story?
I'd refer them to the horror stories, to different people. Then they call me and say, "We want to interview you." And I'll tell them my story, which was ridiculous. I had a printing business that I went bad in 2002. So I couldn't afford to pay the alimony anymore. So I filed for a modification, which is almost impossible to get done. Because the judges don't like to rule. And the lawyer that my ex-wife had would say to me, "Steve, you have a good argument. I feel bad for you, but I'm going to beat you with the law."
Wow. I'm going to beat you with the law.
And when I played lawyer in court, which I don't suggest anybody do, because you're too emotional to do it yourself. Anyway, I had the guy get admonished by the judge for not knowing the law. I caught him in lies, all kinds of stuff. But then the judge didn't rule in my favor.
Wow.
What is going on here? So I figured out the only way I could win was to change that law. And so I set out to do that. And it took me 9 years, but we did it in 9 years.
You you launched the website massalimoneyreform.org, and with your second wife, Jeannie, and other friends, you started the alimony reform movement, which led to that law. Tell them how many years it took you to get to that law, and how much did it cost you in time and effort?
Well, I'll tell you, the stress gave me Parkinson's.
Wow.
The whole thing. Took 9 years of effort, day and night, talking to people on the phone. People would constantly call me up saying their horror stories. I said, don't tell it to me, tell it to the press. If you don't want to tell it to the press, then I can't help you. You have to advocate for yourself. And I mean, at the time, so much more time with my business, eventually I lost the business. I had to sell it for pennies on a dollar just to pay the debts. My house at auction off. I couldn't afford to pay my mortgage anymore. But I fought on. I didn't expect that the law would really benefit me in the end, because my father and brother both died of pancreatic cancer at 66 years old. At the time I was around 60. So I figured I'd never see the end of it, but I did.
So you beat it?
I beat it. So far I beat it. But I gave me Parkinson's, so I don't know what's worse. But my own team shake themselves now. You have to have a good sense of humor to it.
You gotta have a sense of humor when you go through something like that. You said your second wife had to take on a second job just to help.
Yeah, and in an interview on, you can see it on Divorce Corp, the movie, about alimony, the judge said, that suggested that when I couldn't afford to pay the alimony, and I told the judge, I don't want to eliminate it, I just need some help. He said, well, I said, I can't even pay my alimony this week. There's no money. He said, then you're not cooperating, I'll put you in jail. Then a light went on. I said, oh my word, this is how the system's played. I'll figure something out. So I figured out, since I couldn't prove that I couldn't afford to pay the money, just assume that you have all kinds of money. If you're accused, you have to prove you don't have it, which is impossible to do. So I figured out I need a witness that would be authoritative and respected, who would testify that I don't have the money. That would be a bankruptcy trustee. So I filed for bankruptcy, and 3 years later, my bankruptcy was complete. I went back to court, because it was funny because I'll tell you a quick funny story. I went to file for bankruptcy. The lawyer said to me, "Well, you're really screwed. You know, you can't afford to pay this." So I felt really bad about that. I went to another lawyer, and he said, "You're really screwed. You can't afford to pay this." Then I felt so bad. I went to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, "You know, you're really screwed. You can't afford to pay this."
Can't afford to pay this.
I was really screwed. So, anyway, so we go to court after $250,000 did legal fees. We go to court, and we had the judge on the run. There was no way she couldn't rule in my favor at this point in time. So we go to court. And she says, "Well, after 6 or 8 months in court, she says, well, this is gonna have to go to trial. But the problem is, my husband played golf with the bankruptcy trustee about 5 years ago. So I have to recuse myself. You have to start over."
So let's talk about some of the things in the law that you helped to get the governor signed as the great state of Massachusetts. The alimony reform law summary says the first part is that long-term marriages, alimony ends at retirement. So before then, your retirement or your Social Security could be linked into that, right?
Well, yeah. Anything, if you can afford any income that you had or saved for your retirement, is called income that can be used for alimony.
So even though you might have not seen this woman again for 40 years, they can still technically follow you to the grave with alimony.
Well, if you don't have the right separation agreement written in court, they can take your assets.
Wow.
If you're dead.
Wow, that's amazing. Now the second part is the second wife's income cannot be seen as assets. So before you did the bill, they could use her income as part of yours, but after you did the bill, they can no longer do that, right?
That's right. A second wife's income is not cannot be calculated in the equation for alimony.
Okay. Now the third point, which is also important, because this is where alimony goes to a part of a scam. It was if the old spouse cohabitates with another person over 3 months, that can be seen to either decrease the alimony or get it cut off. Because you have a lot of people that are an ex-spouse and they draw alimony from their spouse. They move somebody in the house, or they get married but not at the state level, and they still draw from both people's income. What about that?
We had a guy whose wife got married in Las Vegas. That videotapes of the wedding, the ring, the whole ceremony. But they never filed it.
Wow.
He just
So she was
he
double
didn't
dipping.
done this year. So what would happen is another situation. We had a film of a woman who was dating a rock star, very famous rock star, showing her engagement ring, big diamond, and she wouldn't marry him because she don't lose her alimony.
Okay, let's go to the other part, which is child support. That gross income is excluded from child support.
Okay. Alimony and child support. Don't even use the two in the same sentence. One has nothing to do with the other. Nothing to do with the other. So yeah.
It disattached those two things, right?
Yes, to the part, yes.
And the alimony amount is limited after the bill that you created, right? It was made limited.
Okay, the limitation was put on how long, the duration limits what we put on. So that you could plan for your retirement. Someone knew that, hey, you have 15 years of alimony, 8 years of alimony, 3 years, whatever it would be. They knew what they were going to be getting. They knew that they could not work. And this is not a touchy person because my ex-wife refused to work because she felt entitled to alimony, and she died very. She lived and died a very lonely person.
Wow.
Because if she was forced to go to work, she would have met people. She would have gone on in her life.
But she's seen it as some sort of retirement on your funds.
Yes, it was said in Massachusetts if you had divorced in Massachusetts and you were a receiving spouse, you hit the lottery.
You hit the lottery. That's what I call a scam. That's why I call it the alimony scam. Now, another part of the legislation was that if you had a second job or overtime, that was not included as alimony payment after you fixed it.
Yeah, what was happening is people would take on a second job to pay the alimony, and the ex-wife or ex-spouse would take them back to court for more money.
So you can't win the old procedure.
But we ended that with the law.
That's a beautiful thing. Lucky for a lot of guys. Have you got a lot of guys come to thank you for that?
Yeah, some people are very, very happy about that, especially the cops and firemen. Many of them took second jobs so they could afford the things they liked in life, and then they actually would take it back to court for the extra money. That went away.
Probably attached to pension too, right?
That's another story. Pensions were, they already got hit the pension.
Oh, Lord. Okay, let's go to another part. Payment of health insurance or life insurance reduces alimony in that new legislation.
Yeah, you have to consider that when you get divorced, you have to pay for the ex-spouse's health insurance in many cases. And companies who were carrying them no longer were carrying them.
Wow.
And so that you have to consider the cost of that health insurance and the alimony.
Wow.
Alimony judgment.
Okay, another piece of legislation says alimony terms and extensions were limited.
Yeah, we want to have a formula to it, and the formula we had actually came from a group of in the lawyers' bar that they suggested it, where if you were married for more than 5 years or less than 5 years, you know alimony for 50% of the term of the marriage. Less than 10 years, 60%. Less than 15 years, 70%. Less than 20 years, 80%. If that, a judge could rule for permanent alimony. However, that was limited by retirement. Once you hit the age that you could collect your full retirement benefit, the alimony would end. So there was a safety valve in there.
That's beautiful. Okay, then the last part of legislation says alimony ends with the remarriage of the alimony recipient. We talked about that a minute ago. In the past, would somebody want to remarry somebody and still double dip?
Well, there are certain states, like I believe it's New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire or Vermont. I'm not sure which one. Where even if someone remarries, they still get their alimony.
What kind of antiquated law is that?
Well, they said that they call it compensatory alimony in that state. What it means is that the ex-spouse gave up a job to raise the kids to stay home. So they have to be compensated for the money that they might have earned. I understand that they don't count the laying around the pool all day long. Or the nice cars, or anything. They don't count those. And not having the pressure of work, that doesn't count. Everybody needs to be responsible for themselves. This is crap that people have to rely on the government. It's socialism.
Yeah, it is socialism. That's why I think that it's great what you started, even though it took everything out of you. Some people were sent down here for a purpose. You might have known that purpose when you were young, but it helped a lot of us. And when we pass this information on, it's going to help a lot of guys. And we will include in the link an attachment so they can get to your website, an attachment so because you can also donate to your cause, right?
Well, we're not running the cause anymore. They could call up and get some advice from me. I have a business now. I do. I help people end their alimony obligations to former spouses through negotiation.
Okay. Because it's better to mediate than you said before than to just go to court, right?
Well, yeah, going to court, you're going to lose.
You're going to lose.
You can't win in court. Even if you win, you lose. And here's what people don't realize. If you win a judgment in court, it's what they call a modifiable judgment. So let's say you win to end it. The ex-spouse can come back 10 years later and ask for it again. And get it, usually.
What's that?
So if you get an agreement done, you can what they call survive the agreement, which means it can never be changed. So at least you're done. So whatever it costs to get that surviving agreement, take the deal and run. Is what I say to people. Take there's finality to it. You want finality. The receiving spouse wants some kind of security. The payer wants finality. Somewhere in the middle is going to be a deal. Make that deal and take that deal. You'll both be happy for it. I've had couples that got divorced, and because there was finality to it and security to it, they became friends again. It's amazing.
So if you're on an even keel, they can be friends again.
And great parents to their kids. And that's what's so important.
That's so odd because in a marriage, you couldn't get that. You get a better relationship after the marriage than you could in the marriage.
Oh, yeah, my wife and my new wife, we got back together and we were college sweethearts.
Wow.
And we're very close with her ex-husband. He gets invited to all the family functions. My kids know him. We're like brothers. We shared the same woman for 20 years, 22 years. So we have something in common. And the kids are great. But no, my ex-wife was bitter, and she died very lonely. It was just sad.
Bitterness will make you die lonely. Now, some points that you told me that I'll never forget, you said, don't become an adversary of the court system. Try to work within the system or try to change the system by changing the law. Don't become bitter.
One of the things I did, I found very time-consuming, but it was very important. I got involved with the lawyers' bars, the lawyers' organizations, and I would pay to go to their seminars and learn find out what the enemy was. I call them the enemy, what the opposition was doing. I remember one time there was a judge at this one meeting, and after the presentation at question and answer, I stood up and I said, "Judge, you're a very well-respected judge, and this is who I am." And I said who I was. The room became very quiet, and everyone was looking at me. I said, "Would you rather have consistency and predictability, or would you rather have justice discretion?" And the judge thought of me and said, "Well, we'd rather have predictability and consistency with guidelines and structure." And the lawyers on the panel looked at him and said, "Judge, don't you want the justice discretion?" He said, we'd rather have the guidelines and structure. Well, then lawyers started giving me their business cards, telling them to get a hold of them. There's a lot of lawyers felt the same way. They were afraid to tell it to the judges. So I became known as someone who was very conciliatory with what I was looking for, and not crazy. Not saying I had to be crazy to do what I did. But anyway, they realized that I was not unreasonable and irrational in what I was doing. A lot of these men's groups get irrational and unreasonable. And you can't do that. You have to learn the game, learn the players, and do your intelligence.
I would suggest that people do just like you did. Don't attack the court system. It's not about attacking the lawyers themselves, but to change the law. Those laws are put on the books a long time ago, and they're just sitting there, some of them 100 years or more.
Do you know how long alimony is? Do you know the first time alimony was mentioned?
When is that?
1760, I think 1785 BC.
BC? That's ridiculous.
The Code of Hammurabi.
Wow. And we still go out that today.
And that's the same thing that where at that point in time, a woman was a property of the man. The man had to protect his property and take care of his property. I used to say, I don't believe a woman is property of the man. If anything, the man is property of the woman today.
So that's what we're going to do. It's been great having you, Steve, working up to this interview. Steve Hitner, he's changed the law in Massachusetts from alimony, what it used to be for life, to alimony with limits, where it's not insane anymore. So in your state, if you want to do something like this, Steve has about 13 states that have followed his lead. So his number will be included in this video. A link to his website will be included. You can call him. You can email him. If you have a problem, if you want divorce advice, he's a mediator. I would suggest Steve. Thank you, sir. It's been great having you for this interview. Anything else you want to close with?
Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Good people find their own way of doing things. She packed her bags in the winter and left in the spring. Last seen on a railway platform, soaked to the skin, or a pretty face from an airport window, looking over an aeroplane wing. I got a call from Ireland, said they've seen the most beautiful girl